Dear friends, this sermon is the last in the series of 6 sermons under that general theme, Prepared to Answer. They've all been about how to respond to objections that people may bring up about our Christian faith. And if you're interested in any of the previous sermons, you can go to our Facebook or our YouTube channel, Grace Lutheran Church, Spring Hill, Florida, and all of the sermons are saved there for you, along with a collection of Hollister's as well. So last week we had talked, if you recall, about the image problem that the Christian church, that religion in general seems to have in our country these days. A lot of people claiming that people do evil things in the name of religion. And we realized when we took a look at it as Christians who understand our sinful nature, that is true. That there are times when Christians do very evil things. And sometimes they use their religion as a cover for the evil that they do. But we also recognize that it's not just religious people who do evil things. That there are plenty of irreligious people who do evil things as well. And that all of that evil is a sign of the brokenness of our world. And also a reason for us to understand why we need a Savior. A Savior from our sin. A Savior who can give us hope for eternity. Today, we're going to talk about a different sort of objection. Different in the sense that it's not just a modern phenomenon. This is something that has been around throughout history. In fact, on multiple occasions throughout the Bible, examples are given of people like this. People who are angry with God. So what do you say? What do you say to someone who is angry with God for something that has happened? Well, I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that you can tell them that they're not alone. A lot of people get angry with God. In fact, there were 2 separate surveys that were done in the last 20 years or so in the United States that found that 60% of Americans admit to being angry with God at times. And you've probably met somebody who was angry with God at one time or another. So you know some of the reasons why people get angry with God. Maybe it's because one of their children had cancer. Maybe it was because there was a disaster that killed thousands of people. Or maybe it was as simple as the fact that they lost their job and their feeling of self-worth. And they were angry with God for letting that happen. A woman by the name of Judy Exline, a sociologist at Case Western University, did extensive studies on why it is that people get angry with God. She noted that there are 3 types of anger that people display toward God. She classified them as unjustified anger, defensive anger, and justified anger. By unjustified anger, she meant people who expect special treatment from God. You know, that person that is angry with God because something has happened in their life that happens to all of us, right? Then she talked about defensive anger. That some people use anger with God to cover up their own hurt, their own shame, their own fear, their own responsibility. Why, God, did you let this happen to me? For example, the person who smoked for 40 years and then gets lung cancer, right? How can you be angry for God for something that really is your responsibility, right? And then there's justified anger. That is those times when, why did God let this happen? And the Bible has a good example of that, right? In the book of Job, right? Think about what Job went through, right? First of all, he lost his wealth. Then he lost his family. And then he lost his health. And then finally, his, quote, friends came by, right, and told him that the reason that he lost all these things is because he deserved it. He had done something to earn God's anger. Wow. Why did he get angry with God? Well, we can see. She noted that anger with God can be a fork in the road. Are you going to disengage with God, or are you going to work things out? And she noticed that people who were more religious tended to be less likely to be angry with God. But she also noticed something else that was really fascinating. And that is that in her survey work, the group of people who registered the most anger towards God were people who called themselves atheists and agnostics. And she acknowledged that that isn't very logical, right? Why in the world would somebody be angry with a being that they claimed didn't exist? Right? But I think I have a theory about that. I think that there are a certain number of people in this world who call themselves atheists who are really just mad at God. And that emotion, that anger that's in their heart is so great that they refuse to acknowledge that God even exists. So they have to come up with some sort of rational argument to prove that he doesn't exist, and they end up calling themselves agnostic, even though, or atheist, even though in their hearts, because God has created all of us with this natural knowledge of God, in their hearts, they know that God is real. But the question still remains, how do we respond? What do we say to somebody who is angry with God? I mean, we can't do what God did to Job. God appeared to Job in a storm cloud and he said, "Who is that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." We can't do that. So what do we do when somebody's angry with God? Sometimes the best thing we can do is just to listen. Just to listen and validate the fact that, yeah, okay, you've got your reasons to be angry with God. And then maybe it will give us the opportunity to share God's gracious promises with them as well. Today, I want us to look at an example of some people who became angry with Jesus. They became angry with Jesus over a period of time. It wasn't something that happened quickly. But we can see why it is that they became angry with Jesus. You see, they didn't understand something. They did not understand that God is not our servant. God is God. But God seeks our eternal welfare. Let me read just the last couple of verses of that section from John chapter 6. It goes like this. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Now, I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time giving you the background context of this particular Bible story, because the feeding of the 5,000, that story, is one of only 2 of Jesus' miracles that are recorded by all 4 of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Do you know what the other miracle is that they record of Jesus? Yeah, that's right. The resurrection. Yep, the resurrection. So why is this so important? Why is this story of the feeding of the 5,000 so important? Well, John gives us a clue. You see, John calls this miracle a sign. So it's more than just a regular miracle. It is a sign. And what is a sign? A sign is an act that puts the spotlight on the person who does it in fulfillment of a promise. You know what this means is The fact that Jesus fed between 10 and 15,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread was the fulfillment of a promise that had been made centuries before by Moses. The people indicated that. They said, surely this is the prophet that is to come into the world. Who is this the prophet? Well, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses had said this: the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. You must listen to him. The prophet was also known as the Messiah, the one that God had promised that would come, that would be the Savior. So when the people said, surely this is the prophet, what they were really saying is, surely this is the Messiah. But what's interesting is that they didn't listen to what Moses said. Moses said, when that prophet comes, you must listen to him. And they weren't listening to Jesus. You see, they had a plan. Their plan was that they were going to grab Jesus. I mean, after all, there were 10,000 of them or more. They were going to grab Jesus, and they were going to take him down to Jerusalem because it was almost Passover time. So there would be a huge crowd of Jewish people in Jerusalem. And together, the Jewish people were going to crown Jesus the new king of Israel. They wanted Jesus to rule over them and to give them a free fish meal every day. Right? So Jesus explained to them. We know it's right in the Gospel of John a little bit later. He explains that he didn't come to this earth to establish an earthly kingdom. He came to establish a heavenly one. That he didn't come to save them from the Romans, that he came to save them from the power of sin and death. But what are we told? Well, at the end of this chapter, John notes, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Many turned back and no longer followed him. If you read the Gospel of John, you realize that John is saying that this is the beginning of the end. Jesus had huge crowds following him in Galilee, and all of a sudden, they started turning away. They didn't like what they were hearing. And over the next year, more and more of them would go from being maybe just a little confused and disappointed to being angry with Jesus because he wasn't what they were looking for. And so maybe it isn't so surprising that a year later, at Passover, the Jewish religious leaders could find a crowd of people in Jerusalem who would be willing to stand before Pilate and shout out, "Crucify! Crucify him!" They were angry with Jesus. Jesus had just given them a sign of his divine power, feeding between 10 and 15,000 of them. But instead of listening to him, they tried to get him to do what they wanted. And they got angry when he wouldn't do it. Now, let's understand something. God's ways are mysterious. It is sometimes hard for us to understand why God does things the way he does them. We all would have to admit that if we were in charge, we would do things differently than God does. But we're not God. We don't have his wisdom. We don't have his knowledge. And we don't love the world like he does. One Christian writer put it really well. He said, God doesn't say, figure me out. God says, follow me. God's ways don't seem to make sense. We don't quite understand what to say. And what do we say to somebody who is angry with God? Well, the first thing we can do is listen. And the second thing we can sometimes do is agree that what God is doing doesn't seem to make sense. But it's God's ways. This is His world. It's His plan. And there is something that maybe we can bring up. What is worse? Disappointment with God or disappointment without God? What do I mean? Well, you can say, I am unhappy with the way things are going in this world. I am angry about the way things are going in my life. And you have to decide, are you angry at God? Or is there no God? If you are angry with God, at least you know that there is a purpose in this world. That God made you for a reason. And at least you also know that there is an escape from this world, right? That God has gone, that Jesus has gone to prepare a place for you. Right? But if there is no God, then you still have the disappointment. You still have the anger at the bad things that are happening in your life, but now there's no purpose. There's no reason. There's no plan. You're here by chance. You're all just an accident. And there's no escape. I mean, other than cold, dark, black, death. There is no escape if there is no God. I think I'd rather live with the knowledge that God is true and be occasionally disappointed by the choices He makes, right? Which leads really to the second point for us to remember. And that is that God isn't our servant, but He is concerned. He is seeking our eternal good. Let me just do a what if for a second. Imagine for a second that Jesus let the crowds do what they wanted to do with Him, right? They wanted to take Him down to Jerusalem. They wanted to crown Him the King of Israel. They wanted Him to bring down the legions of angels to destroy the Roman army and give the people of Israel back their great and grand kingdom. They wanted them to make sure, they wanted Him to make sure that they had a fish dinner every day. But then what? They would have lived in prosperity. They would have had what they wanted, but there would still have been sin and Satan and death, and they still would have died with a full belly, but they still would have died. So Jesus makes a choice. He knows what they want Him to do, but He does something different. We are told that He withdrew again to a mountain by Himself. He said, no, what you want from me is not what I am going to do. Jesus went up on that mountain to prepare for what He knew was going to happen. That Jesus would be swept through Jerusalem by a mob that would crown Him not with a golden crown, but with thorns. That Jesus would be lifted up, not by adoring subjects who lifted them to their shoulders, no, but He would be lifted up on a cross. That Jesus would win the greatest victory in the history over the forces of evil, but His victory would cost Him His life. So what do you say to someone who is angry with God because of the hurt that they feel in their life? Well, we need to listen compassionately and understand that anger sometimes comes from real pain and real suffering. Suffering that sometimes we can only begin to imagine. And we sometimes have to admit we don't know why God has allowed such pain into a person's life. But we do know one thing. We know the pain that Jesus endured to save us. Remember how Isaiah put it? He said, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has gone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. God is not our servant. He's God. So he does what he knows is best. But he always does what he does, seeking our eternal welfare. And for that we can be grateful, even in the times when he makes us angry. Amen. May God's peace be yours now. And may you share that peace with others. Let's continue now by confessing